settle in and let your breathing slow, because tonight you are following water that refuses to be hurried. In the dark, the Okavango Panhandle doesn't look like a river with a destination. It looks like a soft ribbon, testing the land, changing its mind with every gentle bend. You might think a river is a clean line on a map, but out here, it is more like handwriting, patient, looping, and quietly rewriting the page. As your sleepless geographer, I'll guide you through meanders, Oxbow lakes, and the calm little tricks water uses to build a delta without ever touching the sea. You are standing at the edge of a river that behaves like a thoughtful person in a crowded room. It does not push, it does not rush, it arrives, and then it decides what kind of place it wants to become. This is the Okavango Panhandle, the long, narrow reach where the river is still a river before it relaxes into the inland delta. You might imagine the water charging in, eager to spread out, but what you actually get is quiet confidence, water sliding forward, carried by a slope so gentle you can barely feel it. The air is damp in a way that feels almost polite. It is not the heavy wetness of a storm. It is the steady humidity of a living shoreline. Reeds, papyrus, low trees, and soft mud that holds footprints like secrets. The water smells faintly green, like crushed stems and sun-warmed algae, and the banks do not rise sharply. They just fade into the land. At night, the river reflects the sky so well you start confusing distances. The surface turns into black glass, broken now and then by a small sound. Something breathing, something stepping, something choosing not to be seen. You think you are looking at still water, stable water, but the truth is less comforting and somehow calmer. Because even here, in the dark, the river is rearranging itself. Not with drama, not with a roaring flood that announces itself. It rearranges itself the way dust rearranges a bookshelf, slowly, constantly, and with the absolute certainty that time belongs to it. One patient curve at a time, the panhandle is being edited. And once you notice that, you start watching the bends themselves. A meander does not begin as a grand loop. It begins as a small wobble, almost an accident, the kind of tiny imperfection you would ignore in daylight. A tree falls into the current. A hippo chooses a crossing point. A patch of bank is softer than the rest. Water meets that little irregularity, and instead of correcting it, the river leans into it. Congratulations, you have found one of the quiet rules of Earth. Moving water is not a neat creature. It does not like straight lines for long. It likes the easy path, the lowest effort, the gentle drift toward whatever yields first. So, you watch the current take a slight bend, and you feel the hidden logic of it. The fastest water, the part with the most energy, tends to swing toward the outside of the curve. It presses against that outer bank like a shoulder against a door that is already loose. Grain by grain, the bank gives up. This is erosion, but not the cinematic kind. Not the cliff collapsing in a cloud of dust. This is the slow shaving away of the outside edge. The river is sanding the landscape down, using nothing but time and repetition. Now look at the inside of the bend. Here, the water is slower. It cannot hold as much sediment. It starts dropping what it carries: sand, silt, bits of plant matter, the fine brown dust of faraway places. The inside bank grows a little shelf, then a little beach, then a gentle slope that invites grasses and reeds to move in. The river is doing two opposite jobs at once. It bites the outside bank and it builds the inside bank. It is both demolition crew and construction crew, and it never asks for overtime pay. If you could hover above the Panhandle in a silent aircraft, you would see these bends like relaxed elbows. They are not random. They are a pattern that emerges when water has room to move and sediment to play with. In steep mountains, rivers cut down. They slice. They hurry. But here, the land is so flat that the river cannot easily dig deeper, so it wanders instead. Think of it like a shopping cart you let go in a parking lot. It does not roll perfectly straight. It drifts, it corrects, it drifts again. Now slow that down until the cart takes decades to cross the pavement, and the pavement is made of soft sand and mud. That is your river, and the longer it wanders, the more exaggerated the wandering becomes. Each bend makes the next bend easier. The outer bank keeps getting eaten away, and the inner bank keeps collecting gentle deposits. The curve becomes wider, then longer, then more confident. The river stretches in its sleep, and the valley accepts the new shape without complaint. You might ask why the river does not simply choose the shortest path. Why not behave like a sensible line from one point to another? But a river is not trying to be sensible. It is trying to balance energy. A straight channel can be too efficient. In a strange way, when water moves very fast, it can carry sediment easily, and it can scour the bottom. But on a flat plain, too much speed in one place can cause instability. The river responds by spreading its work out across a longer path, bleeding energy through friction, through turns, through contact with plants and mud and banks. So the meander becomes the river's compromise. It is how water stays busy without tearing everything apart all at once. And in the Panhandle, you can feel that compromise everywhere. The shoreline is gentle because the river is not cutting a canyon. It is negotiating. It is persuading the land to change shape with the smallest possible argument. If you stand very still and imagine time speeding up, you can almost watch the bends migrate. They do not stay in place. The outside bank erodes, the inside bank grows, and the whole curve slowly walks sideways across the floodplain. It is a strange thing to realize. The river is not just flowing forward, it is also sliding sideways, like a pen line that thickens and shifts each time you trace it. This is how floodplains are written, and you, standing there in the damp dark, are looking at a landscape that is not finished. It will not be finished. They do ongoing. There is a quiet intimacy to this, if you let it sink in. The water is not a visitor. It is the author. Every reed bed, every shallow lagoon nearby, every patch of higher ground where trees choose to gather, these are all footnotes in the river's long story. Now and then the river gets a little too ambitious with its looping. A bend grows wider and wider until the curve begins to fold back on itself. The river makes a big, lazy arc, and the neck of land between two parts of the channel becomes thinner. From above, it looks like the river is almost touching its own past. And that neck keeps narrowing, not because the river is planning it, but because water continues to erode the outer banks. The loop becomes a question that the river is asking the land again and again. How thin can you get before you give in? Eventually, during a flood or a particularly energetic season, the river finds the shortcut. It cuts across the narrow neck. Water loves a shorter path when it can get one. It rushes through the new opening, and the old loop is left behind. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the river changing its mind. The abandoned loop becomes an Oxbow lake, still water curved like a forgotten question mark. It sits there quietly, no longer part of the main flow, but not irrelevant, not even close. Because an Oxbow is a memory that stays wet. At first, it is a clean crescent of water connected to the river only through groundwater seepage and occasional floods. Fish can get trapped inside. Plants move in. The edges soften with reeds. Sediment settles to the bottom, slowly filling the curve like dust collecting in an unused room. The water becomes darker and calmer. Without the main current, there is less mixing, less oxygen. The lake turns into a slow, warm bowl of life and decay. Insects breed. Birds arrive. Crocodiles sometimes choose it as a place to wait because still water is good for waiting. Then, over years and decades, the Oxbow begins to close. The river does not need to touch it again for it to change. Fine silt blows in. Organic matter builds. Plants grow from the edges toward the center, stitching the water shut with roots and stems. One day it is a lake. Later it is a marsh. Later it is a meadow that looks ordinary until you notice its shape from above. An elegant curve in the grass, a subtle bend that no longer carries water, but still carries meaning. The landscape keeps receipts. It just files them quietly under reeds. If you walk across an old Oxbow that has mostly filled in, your feet might find softer ground along the former channel. The soil holds more moisture. The vegetation is greener, or different, or slightly taller. Even when the river abandons a path, the path does not entirely let go of the river. The Panhandle is full of these ghost traces, old channels and former bends, faint arcs and shallow depressions. You can read them like fingerprints pressed into mud if you know what to look for. And you do know what to look for now. You can picture the river doing this again and again. Wobble becoming bend, bend becoming loop, loop becoming shortcut, shortcut becoming new channel, old channel becoming a quiet crescent, crescent becoming meadow, meadow becoming land that looks stable until you remember what it used to be. It is a comforting cycle, in a way, not because it is gentle to everything living here, because it is not always gentle, but because it is consistent. The river does not wake up one morning and choose chaos. It follows rules. It obeys gravity. It responds to slope, sediment, and resistance. It repeats itself until the landscape changes enough to force a new variation. And the longer you watch, the more you realize that these small changes add up. In a place as flat as this, a river's slow wandering can build something that feels bigger than a river, almost like a whole living map. Because downstream, the Okavango does something that makes first-time visitors blink like they have missed a page in the story. Most rivers, in the end, are looking for the sea. They gather water from mountains. They collect tributaries like gossip. And then they hurry towards salt and horizon. They assume an ending. They assume they will arrive somewhere grand, with waves and tides, and that dramatic moment where fresh becomes brackish. The Okavango does not do that. It spreads out and fades into sand. You follow the Panhandle downstream in your mind, and you feel the river's personality begin to change. The channel, once relatively focused, starts to lose certainty. The banks become less defined. The water begins to split. Small side channels peel away like stray thoughts. This is the beginning of an inland delta, an almost unreasonable idea. A delta without an ocean. A fan of water that arrives in the Kalahari like a slow exhale, then disperses into lagoons, floodplains, reed beds, and seasonal pools. Forget the postcard. Here is the hydrologic truth. The Okavango is a river that dies of evaporation and infiltration, not of arrival. It comes from far to the north, from wetter highlands, carrying rainfall that fell in a different season. By the time the water reaches this flat interior basin, it has already traveled a long way. It is tired water in a sense, not weak, just ready to spread out. And the land here does not offer it a clean exit. There is no steep path down to a coastline. This is a basin, a shallow bowl in the crust, shaped by tectonic stretching and faulting over deep time. The river flows into a place where the ground is almost level, and the only way forward is outward. So the delta forms not like a triangle at the end of a river, but like a slow blooming. Channels branch and branch again. Some remain active for years. Some choke with vegetation and sediment and become quiet. Some reawaken during higher floods. Water moves like it is thinking out loud. When the river spreads, it slows. When it slows, it drops sediment. When it drops sediment, it builds tiny ridges and levees that steer future flows. This is soft architecture, banks made not of stone, but of sand, silt, and plant roots. The delta is constantly being remodeled by forces that would be too subtle to notice in a single night. But they are relentless. They work in seasonal cycles and in the long arithmetic of accumulation. And because the water spreads so thin, the sun has an easier job. Heat lifts water into the sky in a quiet, steady transaction. You do not see it happen. There is no sound, just the slow disappearance of surface into air. Evaporation turns floodplains into breathing skins of water and mud, exhaling moisture into the atmosphere. Some water seeps down into the sand, stored briefly in the shallow ground, like a hidden savings account. But the account is not permanent. The region is warm, and plants are thirsty, and the air is often dry enough to take what it can get. So, the river does not end in a crash. It ends in a fade. It is a reminder that endings do not have to be dramatic to be final. And if you find that thought oddly soothing, that is understandable. The Okavango makes disappearance look peaceful. It turns an entire inland basin into a slow-motion wetland. Then lets the water go back to sky and soil with minimal fuss. But to understand why this river vanishes so gracefully, you follow it backward, upstream, into the long, narrow reach where it first gathers itself. Back to the Panhandle, because the Panhandle exists for a reason. it is not just a river corridor by chance. It is the river being guided, gently but firmly, by the shape and structure of the land beneath it. Here, the slope is subtle, but it is enough. Water is extremely sensitive to tiny differences in height. You could spill a cup on a table and watch it find the lowest spot. Now imagine a table the size of a country, tilted by the thickness of a coin over many miles. The water will still find the tilt. It will still obey. The Panhandle is like that, a narrow entrance where the river is still contained, still focused, before it reaches the flatter, more complicated expanse of the delta. The ground beneath may be slightly higher to either side, or the sediments may be arranged in a way that encourages a main channel to persist. In some stretches, the river encounters firmer ground, or older deposits that resist erosion a little more. Not hard rock in the dramatic sense. This is not a granite gorge, but materials that are just cohesive enough to keep a channel from wandering too freely for a time. So, the river holds its shape longer. It stays in a corridor. It behaves almost like the sensible line you wanted it to be on a map, almost, because even here, the river still meanders. It just does so with a quieter range of motion, like someone pacing in a narrow hallway. The bends are there, but the river does not have endless room to slide sideways. And then, gradually, the confinement loosens. As the land flattens even more, the river loses confidence. The single channel begins to split into distributaries, smaller paths that peel away and carry water into new parts of the floodplain. It is like watching a single sentence become a paragraph, then a whole page. This splitting is not only about slope, it is also about sediment, because every flood brings a new load of fine material carried in suspension like dust in sunbeams. You cannot always see it from the surface, especially at night, but it is there, tiny grains traveling in the flow, waiting for the moment the water slows enough to let them fall. When the river is fast, it can keep sediment moving. When it slows, the sediment settles. That settling builds bars and banks and shallow underwater ridges that redirect the current. One season's deposit becomes next season's obstacle. Next season's obstacle becomes a new channel. Plants make this even more effective. Reeds and grasses trap sediment the way a lint filter traps fuzz. They slow the water locally, causing more material to drop. Their roots hold the new deposits in place, turning soft edges into stable green boundaries. So, the delta builds itself with living scaffolding. You can picture a channel beginning as a simple path through shallow water. Then, plants colonize the margins. Then, sediment collects around those stems. The banks rise a little, the flow concentrates. The channel deepens in one place and shallows in another. And eventually, somewhere downstream, a clog forms. Vegetation and sediment building a plug that persuades water to take a different route. Over seasons, channels shift. Some deepen, some clog, some simply stop. The delta is built the way sleep arrives, gradually, then all at once. One minute, you are awake inside a world of distinct edges. The next, you are drifting in a landscape where boundaries soften and direction becomes optional. But water does not only build here, water also disappears. And the way it vanishes is part of what makes the Okavango feel so calm and unreal. Because unlike a river that empties into the sea, this river is constantly negotiating with the atmosphere and the ground. Every pool is a temporary agreement. Heat draws water upward, turning quiet surfaces into invisible vapor. Shallow floodplains spread water thin, making it easier for warm air to take it. The sun does not need waves to do its work. It only needs exposure. Some of the water filters down into sandy layers, and for a while, it becomes part of the groundwater. It moves slowly, sometimes feeding vegetation from below, sometimes re-emerging in a different place. It is the river wearing a disguise, traveling underground, where you cannot watch it. Even when channels dry, the memory of moisture remains. The soil stays softer. The plants stay greener for longer. Animals remember where damp ground lingers. The delta survives by losing water in the most peaceful way possible. And because the water comes and goes in cycles, life here becomes a kind of gentle calendar, one written in wet seasons and dry seasons. Floodwater arrives later than you would expect because it has traveled so far. Rain falls in the distant headwaters, and months pass before that water reaches the delta. So the timing feels slightly out of sync with the local sky. You can stand under a clear season and still watch floodwater arrive, as if the river is bringing news from a different month. Some years the water spreads farther, other years it stays modest, hugging the main channels. The delta expands and contracts like a slow-breathing organism, and everything living here learns to read that rhythm. Animals do not fight it. They adjust. They move with the edges of wet ground. They follow the new green growth when floods bring fresh nutrients. They retreat to deeper channels when dry months tighten the map. Dry months do not feel like disaster in the Okavango the way they might in other wetlands. They feel more like the landscape taking a breath in, consolidating, concentrating life around remaining water, waiting for the next slow arrival. Everything learns the same lesson. Do not fight the schedule of water. And once you have watched an inland delta keep time so quietly, it becomes natural to compare it with other river places, where meanders write different stories into the land, and where a single bend can redraw an entire valley without ever raising its voice. So you let your mind drift outward, away from the Okavango for a moment, to other flat places where rivers have the same bad habit of refusing to commit. You are above a broad valley now, looking down at a river that seems to be doodling. It is not a mountain river, not a knife. It is a ribbon on a soft bed, sliding around as if the land is slightly greasy. From up here, you can see the logic in the loops, not a plan, more like a preference. You think the river is wandering because it is lazy. Wrong. It is wandering because it is busy. In a low-slope landscape, a river has extra energy to get rid of, and not enough downward drop to spend it. So, it spends it sideways. It leans into its banks. It trades speed for friction. It stretches its path longer to calm itself down. Meandering is what happens when water has time, and the ground is willing to be persuaded. And the ground usually is. You can tell what kind of river you are dealing with by what it carries. A river with a heavy load of sand behaves differently than a river carrying mostly mud. Sand wants to settle quickly. It makes bars and beaches and little underwater speed bumps. Mud stays suspended longer. It makes the water look like tea, and it builds smooth floodplains that dry into fine cracks. In many meandering rivers, you get both. A layered, fussy mixture. Sand on the inside bends mud across the wider floodplain after floods. The result is a landscape that looks flat, but is actually full of tiny height differences. Differences so small you would not notice them on foot, and yet they steer a river that weighs more than your imagination. The outside of a bend is usually deeper. It is called a cut bank because the current presses there and keeps cutting. The inside of a bend is usually shallower. It is called a point bar because sediment piles there patiently. You can think of it like the river is always trying to trip itself and always catching its balance at the last second. Over time, those point bars build in layers, like the river is stacking old receipts. Coarser sand first, then finer material, then maybe a thin line of dark organic matter from a flood that brought leaves and rot. If you slice into that bank, you can read seasons and years the way you read rings in a tree. Not as cleanly, not as politely, but it is still a record. And then the river does the thing you already know it will do. It gets bored with its own loop. The cutoff happens, the Oxbow forms, and the main channel slides away. But what is easy to forget is that the river does not just abandon one curve, it abandons many curves over centuries. And those abandoned curves pile up across the valley like old handwriting on erased paper. This is how a floodplain becomes a museum of former rivers. If you have ever looked at satellite images of a big alluvial valley, you have seen these faint arcs, these ghost channels, these barely visible commas in the vegetation. That is not decoration. That is history. The river used to be there, and it left behind a subtle change in soil, in moisture, in elevation that still shows up from orbit. Congratulations! Your river is a very slow animal that molts. Now, bring your attention back to what this means for people. Because humans love flat land near water, the way moths love porch lights. It is fertile, it is easy to build on, it is good for roads, and it is also the exact place a river will eventually decide to occupy again. Without consulting you, you build a town on what feels like solid ground, you put a school on it, and a clinic, and a row of tidy houses. You name streets after trees that do not grow there anymore. Then, a flood arrives, not even an exceptional one, and it finds an old channel under the grass. The water remembers the low spot. It pours into it like it has been waiting. The floodplain is called a floodplain because it floods. This is not subtle. Humans just keep acting surprised because surprise is cheaper than moving. And you can see this pattern all over the world. The Mississippi River wandering across its valley, constantly threatening to swap its mouth for a shorter route. The great rivers of India and Bangladesh, where channels migrate and villages migrate with them. The rivers of the Amazon lowlands, where oxbows dot the forest like dark mirrors. Even in colder places, where the water moves differently, you still get the same story. The Yukon River in Alaska, for example, loops through boreal forest, building and cutting, leaving behind curved lakes that freeze in winter like shut eyes. A meander is not just a bend. It is a method, a way of editing the land. And once you understand the method, you start noticing the small details that make one river's edits look different from another's. The slope, yes. The sediment, yes. But also the plants, the trees, the roots, the animals that dig and trample and disturb the banks. In the Okavango, the plants are not a background. They are a construction material. Papyrus can form thick floating mats. Reeds can stitch together a bank. Grasses can trap fine silt. When a flood spreads thinly across a plain, vegetation decides where the flow slows and where it keeps moving. In other places, you get different engineers. Beavers, for instance, in northern rivers build dams that force water to spill and spread. They create ponds and new wetlands, and sometimes a brand new channel when the old one gets blocked. The beaver does not know it is doing hydrology. It is just trying to be left alone. But the land changes anyway. The Okavango's engineers are quieter. Plants, insects, and seasonal water levels. But the principle is the same. Living things and flowing water cooperate accidentally to rearrange the world. And the longer you watch, the more you realize that a meander is not only about lateral movement, it is also about what happens underground. Beneath a meandering river, water seeps into the banks and back out again. On the outside of bends, pressure can push river water into the ground. On the inside, it can leak back out. This exchange moves nutrients. It shapes where certain plants can survive. It affects how quickly banks collapse. In sandy ground, this seepage can be significant. In clay-heavy ground, it is slower. Either way, the river is not just carving the surface. It is soaking into the edges, weakening them, and occasionally collapsing them in chunks that slide in with a soft, wet sound. If you stand near a cut bank long enough, you might hear it. Not a dramatic crack, just a slump, a sigh, the sound of a piece of land giving up its position and becoming sediment again. This is how the river feeds itself material to move. It erodes, it carries, it deposits, it repeats. It is not creative, it is persistent. Now, speaking of persistence, it is time to admit something about the Okavango that makes it feel a little more eerie and a little more alive. The flood that arrives here is delayed. It comes months after the rain fell in Angola, in the highlands where the Okavango's headwaters begin. So, the delta gets a pulse of water at a time when the local sky might be clear. You can be standing in Botswana in what feels like the wrong season, watching water spread across grasslands, as if the landscape is receiving a late letter. The flood arrives like news from far away, a reminder that a river is not only a local feature, it is a connection between climates, and that delayed flood does something interesting to meandering and channel shifting, because the peak flow does not necessarily match the peak local rainfall. The plants and soils here respond to a rhythm that is partly imported. The river is syncing the delta to a different clock. That is one reason the Okavango feels like it has its own private calendar. Water arrives when it arrives, and the land reorganizes around that schedule. If you want a slightly more technical way to say it, the delta is a place where flow variability, sediment supply, and vegetation growth are tangled together. Not in a complicated math way, more like tangled hair. You can pull one strand and the whole thing shifts. A higher flood year can scour a channel that has been clogging for seasons. A lower flood year can let plants take over a channel that was previously active. Over time, this creates a patchwork of active and inactive waterways. Some are permanent, some are seasonal, some are only active during very wet years, like a road that only exists when traffic gets desperate. And that brings you to a strange truth. The Okavango is not one delta. It is many deltas overlapping in time. The main flow has a few primary channels, but the details change. Old pathways shut down, new ones open. This is called avulsion, when a river suddenly shifts into a new channel. In many deltas, avulsions can be dramatic. In the Okavango, they can still happen, but they often feel quiet from the ground. One season, water is here. Another season, it prefers there. From above, it looks like the delta is breathing and rearranging its veins. From the ground, it feels like you woke up and the familiar route is gone. A channel you paddled last year is now a papyrus wall. Another route has opened, a new ribbon of deeper water sliding through grass that used to be dry enough to walk on. The landscape is not betraying you. It is just refusing to hold still. And this is where the Panhandle makes more sense. That long, narrow corridor upstream is the river's moment of focus. It is the sentence before the paragraph. It is the part where the flow is still mostly committed to one direction, one path. Once the river reaches the flatter interior, it becomes a writer who edits compulsively. Now, let your mind drift to another meandering place, far from the Kalahari, where the same physics makes a very different mood. You are in a temperate valley now, the air cooler, the light softer. The river is still meandering, still eroding the outside and building the inside, but the banks are lined with different plants. Willows, perhaps, leaning over the water like tired listeners. The sediment might be finer. The floodplain might be narrower, hemmed in by low hills. The meanders here might be tighter or more constrained. The valley walls limit how far the river can migrate. So instead of wandering freely, it bumps into the edges of its container. The river makes a loop, then another, then is forced to cut down a little more, or straighten slightly, or stack its deposits differently. Meandering is always a negotiation between water and what resists it, and human beings, of course, add their own resistance. In many places, people do not like a meandering river. It takes up too much space. It floods too often. It changes property lines and turns neat maps into arguments. So people straighten it. They cut off bends on purpose to make shipping easier, to drain land, to control floods. They build levees to keep water in a narrow corridor. They armor banks with rock, so erosion cannot steal land. And for a while, it works. The river becomes a controlled thing, a canal with a river's attitude still trapped inside it. But the river responds the way rivers always respond. If you confine it, it speeds up. If it speeds up, it erodes more strongly where it can. It scours the bed deeper, or it attacks unprotected sections downstream. It drops sediment in new problem areas. It builds up its channel floor in places, making floods worse when they do happen. A river does not stop being a river because you built a wall. It just becomes a river with resentment. The Okavango, in comparison, is allowed to be what it is. That does not mean it is harmless. It means it is honest. The water spreads when it spreads. It retreats when it retreats. People who live near it or move through it learn to treat its changes as normal, and you start to see the deeper comfort in that. A meandering river teaches you that stability is often just slow motion change you have not noticed yet. In the Panhandle, the changes are subtle night to night. A little bank eaten away, a little bar built up. In the Delta, the changes can be seasonal. Channels opening, channels closing. In other river systems, the changes can be sudden and catastrophic if the river decides it has waited long enough, but even the sudden changes are usually the result of long, patient pressure. A bend migrates until a cutoff becomes inevitable. A levee holds until it fails. A channel fills with sediment until water finally chooses another way. This is not drama. It is deferred maintenance. And because you are here for sleep and not for panic, it helps to remember that this is how Earth works in general. Slow forces, long time, and occasional moments where everything catches up. Now, back to the Okavango again, because that is the thread you are holding tonight. Picture the Panhandle's water, dark and reflective, sliding between reed-lined banks. Picture how it carries sediment, not as a burden, but as a tool. Each grain is a vote for where the river will go next. In the delta, much of that sediment is fine. It spreads out, settles in stiller water, and builds low rises. Those rises, even if they are only as tall as your ankle, matter. They become slightly drier places. Plants that hate drowning move in. Trees can establish. Termites might build mounds, lifting patches of ground even higher, creating islands. And now, you have one of the delta's quietest tricks. A termite mound is not just a mound, it is topography. It is a little bump that changes flow patterns during floods. Water goes around it, sediment collects in its wake, plants find refuge there. Over time, the mound becomes the nucleus of an island. Not always a big island. Sometimes just a stubborn patch of dry ground that persists through wet seasons. The delta is full of these small architectural accidents. Vegetation, sediment, animal activity, everything nudging everything else. If you flow through a channel here, you are moving through a place that is being built and unbuilt in the same motion. Clear water sliding over sand, brown water carrying silt, dense papyrus mats that can break loose and drift, forming temporary dams. Hippos carving paths through reeds, creating shortcuts for water and boats. Elephants pushing down trees, opening space for grass, changing how floods spread. The Okavango is sometimes described as pristine. That word is always suspicious. It usually means someone has not looked closely enough. This place is not pristine. It is active. It is busy. It is full of appetite and decay and engineering and theft. Water steals land. Land steals water. Plants steal sediment. Animals steal plants. Everything steals time. And then time steals everything back. But the overall feeling can still be calm because the pace is so often unhurried. Even when something dies here, it tends to be absorbed gently. A fallen tree becomes a snag that catches debris. Debris becomes a small bar. A small bar becomes a bank. A bank becomes a new edge for a channel. Depth becomes infrastructure. Now, let the scale shift again. Pull back in your mind until you can see the delta's fan shape, not a triangle pointing into an ocean, but a spreading handprint pressed into the interior of a continent. The water enters, disperses, and vanishes. That vanishing is the delta's defining act. Evaporation takes a great share because the climate is warm and the water is shallow in many places. Transpiration takes another share because plants pull water up and release it through leaves, turning liquid into air with quiet efficiency. Infiltration takes another share, soaking into sandy layers and moving slowly underground. And because the delta is so flat, the water has a lot of surface area. It spreads thin, it warms, it disappears upward. You can imagine the sun as a patient accountant taking small payments all day long. No big withdrawals, just constant, steady lifting. And this creates another odd effect. Minerals can concentrate in some areas where water evaporates and leaves salts behind. In some parts of the broader region, you can get salt pans, bright and flat, where water once lingered and then left its residue. Not every part of the Okavango becomes salty because the system is constantly flushed by new floods in many areas. But the general principle holds. Where water stands and evaporates repeatedly, it leaves behind what it cannot carry away as vapor. So the delta's chemistry is part of its geography. The plants you see, the animals you see, the places that stay wet longer, the places that dry faster, these are shaped by invisible dissolved stuff as much as by visible channels. And the channels themselves, of course, keep rearranging. If you want to understand why channels in the delta shift so often, it helps to picture a channel as a temporary agreement between flow and obstruction. A channel exists where water is deep enough and fast enough to keep itself open. The moment it slows too much, sediment begins to settle. Vegetation begins to colonize. The channel narrows. The flow slows more. More sediment drops. More plants grow. The channel chokes. This is not failure. This is the system doing what it does. Closing one route forces water to explore another. Exploration spreads flooding across a wider area. Wider flooding supports more habitat diversity. More diversity supports more life. More life affects the flow again. A delta is a feedback machine. And if that sounds complicated, it does not have to feel complicated. You can reduce it to something simple. Water follows the easiest path. Then it makes that path harder by dropping sediment and growing plants. Then it finds a new easiest path. Then it makes that harder too. It is the same behavior you have with clutter in a room. You keep using the same chair for laundry because it is convenient. Then the chair becomes unusable. Then you choose a different chair. The river is just doing this with geography at a time scale that makes your habits look frantic. Now, since you have wandered with rivers in general, and you have returned to the Okavango's particular personality, you can let your mind step into one more gentle comparison. A river that meanders in a way that feels familiar but with a different ending. Think of a classic coastal delta where a river meets the sea. The river slows abruptly when it hits standing water, dropping sediment in a fan. Over time, it builds land outward into the ocean. It makes distributary channels that split and rejoin. It builds levees and wetlands, and the coastline becomes a shifting edge. That is a delta with an exit. The sea is the receiver. The Okavango is a delta without that receiver, so the water must be received by air and sand instead. The distributaries still form, the sediment still drops, the wetlands still spread, but there is no final channel that becomes brackish and then salt. It is a delta that ends in absence, and that absence is not empty. It is full of process. It is full of invisible lifting and slow seeping, and plants drinking the flood. So when you stand at the Panhandle at night, listening to water slide past reeds, you are hearing the beginning of a story that ends in evaporation. A river that spends itself inland, not because it is weak, but because the land is shaped like a shallow bowl that refuses to drain. You might expect a river to feel like a line. Here, it feels like a hand spreading open. Now, let your attention settle on one more small detail that is easy to miss when you talk about rivers as if they are only water. A river is also temperature. In shallow floodplains, water warms quickly during the day and cools at night. That daily cycle affects how much evaporation happens, but it also affects life. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cool water. That matters for fish, for insects, for decomposition. It changes which channels become murky, which stay clear, which become choked with plants. Clear channels in the Okavango often come from filtration through sand, where water has seeped underground and then returned, leaving sediment behind. This can create those famous clear lagoons and channels where you can see underwater grasses waving and fish moving like little commas. Other areas are tea-colored, stained by organic matter. Water moving through wetlands picks up tannins, the same compounds that stain tea. It is not dirty in a simple sense. It is chemically rich, full of the dissolved story of plants. So even within one delta, you have different flavors of water, different moods. And those moods help decide where certain meanders persist and where channels clog. Dense vegetation can stabilize banks, but it can also trap sediment and close pathways. In sandy areas, channels can shift more easily. In areas with more cohesive sediments, banks hold longer, making more stable meanders. You can start to see why the Panhandle is relatively focused. It has confinement, subtle slope guidance, and bank materials that can hold a main channel together longer. Then downstream, the flatness and sediment and plant growth create a branching, shifting mosaic. It is not random. It is just too slow and too subtle to feel like cause and effect when you are living inside it. Now, since you have been hovering above floodplains and deltas in your mind, it is time to lower yourself back down to ground level again. Back to the human scale, where the meander is not a diagram, but a curve you have to paddle around. You are moving through a channel at night, the water a dark mirror, the banks close enough that reeds brush each other in the breeze. The current is gentle, but it is there, and it has a direction you can feel more than you can see. Every so often, the channel curves. You follow it because you have no choice. A meander is not a suggestion when you are inside it. It is the room you are walking through. On the outside of the bend, the water feels slightly more insistent, slightly deeper. If you could see beneath the surface, you would see a steep underwater slope, the cut bank continuing down. On the inside of the bend, the water shallows, and you might hear small disturbances, the whisper of water over a sandy point bar. This is where animals like to cross sometimes, because shallow water feels safer, which is an adorable thought, until you remember what lives in shallow water too. In places like this, a meander is not just a geomorphic feature. It is an ecological edge. The deep outside bend might shelter certain fish. The shallow inside might grow certain plants. Birds might hunt along the margins. Hippos might use the deeper parts as daytime refuge. Crocodiles might choose the curve as an ambush line, because curves are good for hiding. A river bend is a strategy for life as much as it is a strategy for water. and humans, predictably, try to turn it into a strategy for themselves. In the Okavango region, people have long used seasonal flooding patterns to fish, to graze livestock on retreating floodplains, to move along waterways when they are navigable. The timing matters. The flood pulse creates access and opportunity, then removes it. You cannot force the delta to behave. You can only learn its rhythm. The communities around the delta have knowledge that does not always show up in textbooks. Which channel tends to hold water longer? Which floodplain becomes usable pasture after the water retreats? Which islands stay dry in a big year, where the ground looks solid but is actually a soft trap? This is a different kind of map, a lived map drawn in memory and repetition, and it is necessary because the physical map keeps changing. Now, if you let your mind drift slightly upstream again, you can feel how a meandering river also shapes the Panhandle's sense of width. In a straight river, the corridor is narrow and predictable. In a meandering one, the effective corridor is wider because the bends migrate. Over centuries, the river can occupy a broad belt, even if at any given moment it looks like a single channel. This belt is called a meander belt, and it is basically the river's roaming allowance. In the Panhandle, that allowance is limited by subtle topography and bank strength. In other valleys, it can be wide enough to swallow entire settlements over time. And the belt contains those ghost features you already know. Oxbows, scroll bars, abandoned channels, the remnants of previous routes. Scroll bars are especially quiet. They form as point bars grow and shift, leaving behind ridges and swales on the inside of bends. From above, they can look like nested curves, like the river has been combing the floodplain. If you stand on such a surface, it might feel flat. But the slight ridges can be drier, the swales wetter. Plants arrange themselves accordingly. The floodplain becomes subtly striped by moisture differences, all because the river kept building and moving, building and moving. This is what I mean when I say the landscape keeps receipts. Now, speaking of receipts, the sediment itself is a receipt from upstream. The Okavango's water begins far away, and so does its sediment. Tiny mineral grains eroded from distant rocks, carried through countless small streams, then into the main river, then down into the Panhandle, then into the Delta. Each grain has a long, undramatic biography. It was once part of a bedrock outcrop. Then it became part of the soil. Then it washed into a stream during rain. Then it bounced and rolled and floated depending on its size until it reached a place where the water slowed enough to drop it. And in the delta, water slows all the time. So the delta is a sediment trap. It catches the river's load and spreads it out. Over a long time, this can build up the delta surface, raising parts of it, changing where water prefers to go. It is one reason deltas are always reorganizing. They are building their own obstacles. And the river, being the patient creature it is, responds by finding new pathways around those obstacles. You can think of it like this. The river arrives with a suitcase full of sediment. It empties the suitcase across the floor. Then it complains that the floor is cluttered and chooses a new route through the room. Now you might wonder, if the delta keeps filling with sediment, why does it not just become dry land entirely? The answer is that the delta is not only receiving sediment, it is also losing it. Some sediment is carried farther into distal floodplains. Some is reworked by channels again and again. Some is blown by wind during dry periods. Some is compacted and becomes more stable ground, supporting vegetation that changes the hydraulics. And the system has existed long enough to find a rough balance. Not a perfect one, not permanent, but a living equilibrium that shifts year to year. Also, the basin itself is not static. The broader region is influenced by tectonic structures, faults, and subtle subsidence that help maintain low gradients and interior drainage. You do not need dramatic earthquakes to shape this. Slow movement is enough. Earth can change the playing field at the same pace a river changes its course. A delta without a sea is, in a way, a compromise between tectonics and climate. The land is shaped to hold water inland, and the climate is shaped to take that water away again. Now, if you keep following this thread, you eventually come back to the simplest, most powerful idea in meandering rivers. A river is always looking for the lowest energy way to move water downhill. It will erode where it must. It will deposit where it can. It will shift where resistance changes. It will not respect your timeline. It will not respect your property lines. It will not respect your sense of what the land is supposed to look like. It will simply keep moving and keep adjusting. And that is why, when you see a calm bend at night, it is worth remembering that the calm is only the surface emotion. Beneath it is a constant mechanical decision. Water particles responding to slope, friction, turbulence, and sediment load. Turbulence is one of those words that sounds dramatic, but here it is mostly small, persistent swirls. The flow in a bend tends to spiral, creating a corkscrew motion. Near the surface, water is pushed toward the outside bank. Near the bed, it can move toward the inside. This helical flow helps move sediment from the outside bank area toward the point bar. So a bend is not just a curve, it is a three-dimensional conveyor belt. That spiral motion is one reason point bars build so reliably. The river is not only slowing down on the inside, it is actively transporting material toward it with a sideways, rolling circulation. If you could see the current lines in the dark, you would see them twisting like smoke. And once you know this, you can imagine the Panhandle not as a simple channel, but as a moving machine, quietly sorting grains by size and weight. Coarser particles settle sooner, finer ones travel farther. During floods, the sorting changes. The river's mood changes. It carries more, it spreads more, it deposits more widely. Then the flood passes, and the river returns to its lower flow habits, working within the new arrangement it created. This is why floodplains are fertile. Floods deliver fine sediment rich in nutrients. They lay down new soil without asking. If you farm on a floodplain, you are taking advantage of a river's generosity, and also signing up for its occasional violence. In the Okavango, the flood is not usually a wall of destruction. It is a slow spreading, but even slow spreading water can be dangerous because it changes what is solid and what is not. A dry crossing becomes a deep channel. A familiar path becomes a deeper pool. The risk is not always drama. Sometimes it is just miscalculation. Now, since you have compared the Okavango's meanders to other rivers, and since you have walked through the mechanics of bends and sediment, you can start letting the story drift toward the next set of details. The ones that make the delta feel like a place that is constantly half vanishing. Because you can talk about evaporation in a simple way, water goes up. And you would be correct. But the calm unreality of this delta comes from the specifics, the way heat, wind, shallow depth, and plant transpiration collaborate, the way sand stores water briefly and then releases it, the way the sky becomes part of the drainage system. If you want to know where the Okavango goes, you start by accepting an insult from the air. The air is better at theft than you are. Out on the floodplain, the sun does not need to boil anything dramatically. It just warms a thin sheet of water until the surface molecules get ambitious. A few escape, then a few more, and by the time you think to check again, the level has dropped in a way that feels personal. You think evaporation is only about heat, but wind is the accomplice that makes it efficient. Wind removes the damp, already satisfied air hovering over the surface and replaces it with drier air that still wants more. The delta is not just a wet place, it is a place where the atmosphere keeps being given a fresh appetite. And because the water is shallow in so many areas, it warms quickly. Shallow water has less thermal patience. It is a wide pan, not a deep pot. During the day, it absorbs heat fast, and at night, it gives it back quietly, like a tired animal exhaling. Now add plants. You do not notice transpiration unless someone tells you to feel it. You stand near a dense reed bed, and the air has a soft thickness to it, as if the plants are breathing right next to your ear. They are. Water is pulled up through roots, carried through stems, released through leaves, and handed back to the sky in invisible slips. It is not a metaphor when people call a wetland a sponge. It is a sponge that sweats, and the plants do it on purpose. In their indifferent plant way, releasing water helps pull more water upward. It cools leaves, it keeps internal chemistry moving, it keeps the whole green machine from overheating. The delta becomes a factory for humid air, even as it is trying to lose its water. So you have two steady exits, evaporation off open surfaces and transpiration off living surfaces. The sky gets paid twice, but the third exit is quieter, and in this place, it is almost more important. Infiltration. Infiltration is water slipping down through sand, the way a secret slips under a door. You walk along a bank that looks firm, and you forget that sand is basically a pile of tiny gaps. The water finds those gaps, and it goes down, not because it is dramatic, but because gravity is always on duty. In the Okavango, much of the delta sits on deep, sandy deposits. Not clean beach sand, not polite sand, but sand laid down over long time by rivers, by ancient wind, by older climates that rearranged this region when it was wetter or drier or simply different. When floodwater spreads out, some of it sinks. It becomes groundwater for a while. It moves slowly, pushed by tiny differences in pressure and elevation, and it can reappear in surprising ways. This is where the delta starts to feel like it is cheating. You might see a channel with unusually clear water when everything around it looks tea-colored and plant-stained. That clarity can happen when water has filtered through sand underground, leaving fine particles behind. It is the same trick a simple water filter uses, just done at landscape scale, with a patience that would make a laboratory weep. So the delta is not only surface water, it is also a shallow underground exchange, a slow seep that connects channels, lagoons, and islands in ways you cannot see. Water is traveling under your feet while you watch it drift at the surface. Congratulations, you are standing on plumbing. Now, Because you are human, you want to imagine this infiltration as storage, like the delta is banking water underground, saving it for later. And sometimes that is true, briefly. But the bank is leaky. Plants tap into shallow groundwater. In dry months, when surface pools shrink, deep-rooted vegetation can keep drinking from below. The water table drops. Plants follow it down as far as their roots can reach. And then, when the roots fail, the green fades. And in some places, groundwater is not a gift. It can become salty. This is one of the delta's quieter contradictions. When water infiltrates and then later evaporates near the surface, it leaves minerals behind. Over time, those minerals can accumulate in certain low spots or in places where groundwater rises and then loses water to the air. Salts concentrate because they do not evaporate. They just wait. In many river deltas that drain to the sea, salts can be flushed away. Here, the flushing is limited, so you get pockets of salinity, little chemical scars that shape which plants can survive. Some areas become saltier pans, flatter and brighter, hostile in a way that looks clean from far away. The result is a wetland that can contain dry, salty places like punctuation marks. Now, none of this happens evenly. One part of the delta can be flooded, and another can be dry enough to crack. One channel can run clear, another can run dark. One island can stay green through a dry season, another can lose leaves early. The Okavango is a mosaic, and the mosaic shifts. And here's the part that always feels slightly wrong. In the best way, the flood pulse arrives when the local rain is not necessarily falling. You are in the dry season locally. The sky is pale and stingy. And then water starts rising anyway. It moves in with the calm confidence of something that does not care what your calendar says. It is delayed water. Water that fell months ago in distant headwaters, traveling down through Angola and across long distances, arriving when you least expect it. The delta's life is synchronized to a faraway storm schedule, so when the flood arrives, it spreads into floodplains that have been waiting. Grasses respond quickly. Fresh growth appears in places that were dull and brittle. Nutrients carried in the water settle out, and suddenly, the land has a new skin. And then, the theft begins again. The floodwater spreads thin. The sun takes its cut. The plants take theirs. The sand drinks what it can. And the water retreats, not as a panicked withdrawal, but as a slow disappearance, like someone turning down the volume. This is why the delta can feel calm. The main drama is not a wall of water. It is a slow change in availability. Life here is built around edges, the edge of wet ground, the edge of dry ground, the edge of a channel that is navigable, the edge of a pool that will last another month. You start to see animals as professional edge readers. A herd will graze where floodwater recently retreated because new grass is tender and nutrient-rich. Predators will patrol those same zones because prey has to show up eventually. Birds will work shallow margins because shallow margins concentrate small fish and insects. Everything moves along boundaries that are always shifting. If you want to understand the delta as a calendar, you stop thinking in months and start thinking in water levels. The year is not divided into tidy boxes here. It is divided into phases: water arriving, water spreading, water lingering, water leaving. And the timing is peculiar. In many places, rain falls, rivers swell, floods happen quickly, then the land dries. In the Okavango, the main flood peak tends to arrive in the cooler months, after rains far upstream have already done their work. It is a second season laid over the first, like a delayed echo. So, you can have local rain and local flooding that are out of phase. You can have a place where the biggest water is not a response to the sky above you, but to the sky far away. This matters for how channels behave. When water levels rise gradually, plants have time to respond. Vegetation can grow into shallow water, slowing it and trapping sediment. That can stabilize banks, but it can also help choke small channels. In faster, flashier floods, vegetation can be ripped out and rearranged more violently. The Okavango's flood is often patient, and that patience gives plants more influence. In other words, the river is not the only engineer. The timing of the river gives the plants a seat at the table. Now, because you are walking through this in your mind at night, the details get tactile. You step onto what looks like dry ground, and your boot presses into a skin of soil that is drier on top and wet underneath. It gives slightly, like a mattress that remembers weight. This is the delta's trick. In dry months, moisture stays just below the surface in many areas, held in fine sediments and shaded by vegetation. That hidden moisture is why some places green up quickly when the flood returns. Seeds are already there. Roots are already there. The system is not restarting from nothing. It is resuming. And the way the flood spreads is not uniform. It follows microtopography, tiny differences in elevation that are too small to see unless you have been humbled by them. A rise as high as your ankle can remain dry, becoming an island. A depression as shallow as your hand can fill first, becoming a temporary pool. These small differences decide where hippos can travel, where boats can go, where fish can move, where certain plants can establish. The delta is shaped by almost invisible slopes, and the Panhandle upstream is where the river still behaves like a single thought. Down there, in the wide delta, it becomes many thoughts at once. But because this whole system runs on cycles, it means the map is never quite reliable. There is no permanent promise that a channel will stay open. Some channels are more persistent, yes, often deeper, often kept clear by enough flow to resist clogging. But smaller channels can vanish within a few seasons, closed by reeds and sediment, like a slow zipper. If you are traveling here, you learn not to get attached to routes. A channel you used last year might be blocked by papyrus mats now, thick and floating and annoyingly confident. A lagoon that was open water might be a meadow in a decade. A dry flat might become a seasonal floodplain. The delta does not like permanent infrastructure. Humans naturally try anyway. People build in places that seem safe, often on slightly higher ground, along stable channels. They learn which islands stay dry in most floods. They learn which floodplains become good grazing after water retreats. They time fishing with the flood pulse because fish move with water, and water decides where the fish can be. This is not romantic, it is logistics. In a flood pulse system, fish can spawn in flooded grasses where young fish have shelter and food. When water retreats, those fish are funneled back into channels and pools, concentrating them. That concentration can make fishing more productive, but it also makes the system vulnerable if pressure is too high. The delta's calendar is generous, but not infinite. And then there is the question you keep circling without saying out loud: why does the flood arrive late? And why does it feel so steady? Part of it is distance. Part of it is the way water moves through upstream wetlands and floodplains, slowing the wave. Think of it like a message traveling through a crowded room. It takes time. It gets delayed by obstacles. It arrives stretched out, less sharp, more drawn out. In hydrology, people talk about a flood wave moving downstream. In the Okavango, the wave is long and smooth because much of the upstream system stores and releases water gradually. By the time it reaches the delta, it is less of a punch and more of a slow tide. And that tide-like behavior, rising and falling inland, is one reason people describe the Okavango as unreal. It behaves like an ocean breath, but it is hundreds of miles from salt water. Now, you have been patient, so here's a detail that makes the Panhandle and Delta feel even more like a living machine. Not all water in the Delta takes the same path or the same amount of time. Some water stays in main channels and moves relatively quickly. Some spills into floodplains, slows, and lingers for months. Some infiltrates, moves underground, and reappears later. If you could tag a drop and follow it, you would find it living different lives depending on where it goes. This mixing of fast and slow pathways is part of why the delta can maintain water in some places even as others dry. It is not one uniform body of water. It is a network with different speeds, like traffic patterns. And because it is a network, changes in one part can ripple into others. A channel clogs. Water is forced elsewhere. A new floodplain gets wetter. Vegetation changes. Sediment deposition changes. And suddenly, the preferred routes shift again. These are feedbacks, the kind that make a landscape seem moody when it is actually just responsive. This is also where the delta's famous islands come into focus again. Some islands are built from sediment deposits, levees, and plant-trapped material. Some are built from termite mounds and animal activity. Some are older, more stable, slightly higher surfaces that have persisted through many cycles. Termites deserve their quiet credit here, even if you do not like them. A termite colony brings fine material up from below and piles it. It mixes soil. It changes drainage. It creates a raised platform that is less likely to flood. That platform allows woody vegetation to establish, trees and shrubs that would drown in lower ground. Those trees then add leaf litter, shade, and root structure, stabilizing the island further. So a small insect city becomes the foundation for a forest patch. The forest patch becomes an obstacle to flow. Flow goes around it. Sediment drops around it. The island grows. This is cozy in a geological horror sort of way. The delta is being shaped by tiny jaws and tiny roots, as much as by water. And once islands exist, they create more edges, more habitat types, more choices for animals, more complexity. You can look at the delta as a simple fan of water, or you can look at it as a shifting quilt of wet and dry patches stitched together by seasonal timing. And timing is everything. Some years the flood is larger, spreading farther into marginal areas. In those years, channels that have been quiet can reawaken. Water pushes through old pathways, scours vegetation, clears blockages, reasserts routes that were almost forgotten. Other years, the flood is smaller. In those years, vegetation wins more territory. Channels shrink. Some lagoons do not fill. the delta contracts and life concentrates more tightly around remaining water. This is not a failure year versus a success year. It is variation. It is how a system avoids being too predictable, which is important because predictability invites overuse. If the delta did the same thing every year, it would be easier to exploit until it broke. Instead, the delta insists on being slightly unreliable. Congratulations! You are trying to live on a moving schedule that refuses to publish itself. Now, while all this is happening, the Panhandle upstream keeps delivering water, and with it, fine sediment and dissolved minerals. The Panhandle is the entrance corridor, and it has its own role in the delta's calendar because that narrow reach can act like a conveyor, focusing flow before it spreads. In the Panhandle, the river is often deeper and more channelized. That can mean less surface area relative to volume and therefore less immediate evaporation compared to shallow floodplains. The water is more protected there, shaded by banks and vegetation, less exposed. So the Panhandle is like the delta's throat. It carries water inward before the landscape can start taking bites out of it. And once water exits that throat into the wide delta, it starts to get disassembled. Now, you have heard enough about water going up and down. It is time to talk about where exactly the water chooses to linger. Because the delta is not evenly wet. There are zones that tend to stay wetter year-round, and zones that are more seasonal. The wetter zones often align with deeper channels and permanent lagoons. The seasonal zones are floodplains that only receive water during part of the flood cycle. This division affects everything, including soil. In permanently wet areas, soils can be more organic, with slow decomposition under low oxygen conditions. Plant material accumulates, creating dark, rich layers. In seasonal floodplains, soils can be more mineral, frequently exposed to air, cracked by drying, then re-wetted. That alternation can create a kind of soil rhythm, swelling when wet, shrinking when dry. If you have ever seen drying mud crack into polygons, you have seen a small version of the stress the soil experiences. Over years, that cracking and refilling can mix layers and shape surface texture. So even soil is part of the calendar. And the chemistry shifts too. When soils are flooded, oxygen becomes limited and different microbial processes dominate. When soils dry, oxygen returns and decomposition accelerates. Nutrients can be released in pulses when conditions change, which helps explain why fresh green growth can be so rapid after flooding. You can think of it as the delta switching between two modes: wet mode, slow and low oxygen, and dry mode, faster and airy. Life adjusts to both. Now, you might wonder how clear water can exist in such a dynamic sediment system. The Okavango is famous for clear channels in many places, and that is partly because much sediment settles out upstream, and partly because of filtration through vegetation and sand. Slow-moving water in floodplains allows fine particles to drop. Vegetation traps suspended matter. When water then returns to a channel, it can be surprisingly clean. The delta is like a settling tank, constantly clarifying its own water. But the clarity is not universal. During peak flood, or when channels shift and banks erode, water can be more turbid. After storms, local runoff can add pulses of sediment, and where hippos move, they can stir bottom sediments, creating cloudy zones. Yes, Even a large animal can do hydrology by walking. Hippos are famous for their trails through vegetation, which can become flow pathways. Their daily movements between feeding grounds and water create channels and reeds, and those channels can guide water during floods. They can widen passages, keep them open, and alter where water concentrates. So the delta's network is not only carved by current, it is also trampled. Elephants, too, contribute in their own slow, blunt way. They push over trees, open up patches, dig for water in dry periods, and create depressions that can hold water longer. Their paths become corridors. Their disturbances change vegetation structure, which changes flow resistance, which changes how floods spread. It is not that animals control the delta, it is that the delta includes them as moving parts. Now, pull back slightly and remember the promise you started with tonight, how a river's meandering and its unwillingness to commit to straight lines helps create the form and behavior of places like the Panhandle. The Panhandle is narrower and more focused because of subtle topography and channel containment. But within it, meandering still occurs. Those bends migrate slowly, shaping a meander belt. That belt influences how floodwaters spill during higher stages. When the river rises, it overtops banks in some areas, delivering sediment to the floodplain. Natural levees can form, low ridges built by repeated overbank deposition. These levees are not walls, they are gentle rises, but they matter. They can keep some water in the main channel longer, and they can guide spill into certain low areas rather than others. Over time, levees can help stabilize where the main corridor sits, even as it meanders within it. So the Panhandle is not just a single trench, it is a slightly raised corridor, flanked by its own repeated flooding. And then, downstream, where the confinement eases, those same processes create distributaries and island networks. In other words, meandering is part of the delta's architecture, not separate from it. Now let yourself sink into a slower thought. The delta is a place where water arrives, spreads, and then leaves without leaving in one direction. That means the delta's concept of downstream is different. In a normal river, downstream is obvious. Follow the flow, you get somewhere. Here, flow splits, slows, infiltrates, evaporates. Downstream becomes a set of possibilities rather than a single arrow. So, if you are water, you do not have a guaranteed path. You have options, and most of them end in air. That changes the meaning of the channel itself. A channel is not only a route, it is a temporary refuge from loss. Deeper water evaporates more slowly than shallow water because it has less surface area relative to volume. It stays cooler. It stays shaded. It is less exposed. So channels are where water hides from the sky. Floodplains are where the sky finds it. This is why in dry months, life concentrates in channels and permanent lagoons. These are the last places where water can keep its identity. Everything else becomes damp soil, then dry soil, then dust. And if you stay with that thought long enough, you realize something slightly unsettling. A wetland like this is defined as much by dryness as by water. The delta is not one continuous swamp. It is a shifting pattern of wet and dry, and the transitions are the whole point. Flooding brings nutrients and habitat. Drying resets vegetation, prevents some plants from dominating everywhere, limits aquatic predators in seasonal pools, concentrates fish, and makes room for grazing. The alternation creates diversity. So the delta survives by being inconsistent. Now, because this is the section where you watch water vanish, it is worth noticing how the vanishing is not always vertical. Sometimes water leaves the surface by becoming groundwater. Sometimes it moves laterally underground, feeding areas away from the main channels. This can create so-called seep zones, where water emerges slowly and keeps patches green longer. If you walk across what looks like ordinary grassland at the edge of the delta, you might find a line where the grass shifts in color. Slightly greener, slightly taller. That can be a sign of subsurface moisture moving through sandy layers. So the delta's boundary is fuzzy, not only on the surface, but underground. And that fuzziness makes mapping difficult in a way that feels almost philosophical. You want clean lines. The delta offers gradients. Now, gradually, your attention drifts from the mechanics of vanishing to the rhythm it creates. Because once you accept that water comes late, spreads gently, and leaves quietly, you can start feeling the Okavango as a timepiece. Not a clock with hands, a clock with edges. The flood arrives first in certain northern and eastern parts of the delta, closer to the main inflow. Then it spreads later into other areas. Some regions receive water for only a short season. Others stay wet much longer. So, if you live here, the year is not one season. It is a sequence of moving wetness across space. Animals track this. They follow the flood front as it moves because it brings fresh grazing. You can picture the flood edge as a slow-moving line, and herds moving with it, not because they understand hydrology, but because they understand grass. Predators follow herds. Birds follow shallow water. Fish follow connectivity. Connectivity is a quiet word that matters a lot here. When floodwater connects isolated pools to channels, fish can move, genes can mix, populations can spread. When water retreats and disconnects pools, those pools become temporary worlds. Some fish survive, some do not. Some pools dry completely, and the story ends there until the next flood. So each year, connectivity expands and contracts, and life either rides it or gets stranded by it. If you want to understand why seasonal flooding is so productive, think about what happens when land that was dry becomes underwater grassland. Suddenly, you have huge surface area for algae and microbes. You have plant stems for insects to cling to. You have shallow, warm water that accelerates growth. Juvenile fish have shelter. Birds have feeding grounds. Grazers have fresh shoots when water retreats. The floodplain becomes a temporary buffet. Then, as the water pulls back, that productivity gets concentrated into channels, and the food web tightens. It is like the delta is alternately spreading out its resources, then gathering them back in. A slow inhale, a slow exhale. Now, there is one more feature of this calendar that keeps it from being too simple. Not all years are the same, because rainfall in the headwaters varies. Climate patterns shift, sometimes over several years, affecting how much water enters the system. Temperature affects how much is lost to evaporation. Vegetation cover changes with grazing and fire, which affects flow resistance and infiltration. Fire is another quiet participant. In dry months, parts of the delta and surrounding savanna can burn. Fire removes old plant material, opens up space, changes surface roughness. When the flood returns, water flows differently through burned areas than through dense, unburned vegetation. sediment trapping changes. Channel clogging patterns can change. So even fire is part of the hydraulics, indirectly. And because this is an inland system, it is sensitive to relatively small shifts. There is no giant ocean buffer at the end. The balance is local and atmospheric. A slightly hotter year can mean more evaporation. A slightly lower inflow year can mean less flood extent. The delta responds. But again, response here is rarely sudden. It is usually gradual and then visible only in hindsight. You return after a few years away and you realize a familiar lagoon is smaller, a channel is harder to reach, a floodplain is more shrub-filled. The delta has been editing while you were gone. Now, speaking of editing, this is where you start noticing that the delta does not only expand and contract, it also shifts its emphasis. Some distributary channels become more dominant for a while. Others decline. This can happen through gradual sedimentation, vegetation growth, and small avulsions where flow suddenly chooses a new route. An avulsion sounds like a disaster word. It can be in other rivers. Here, it is often just the delta making a lateral decision. A channel bed rises over time as sediment accumulates. The channel becomes slightly perched above adjacent floodplain. During a high water event, water spills over bank and finds a lower path nearby. Once that new path captures enough flow, it deepens, and the old channel becomes less used, then clogged, then abandoned. It is like a road that slowly becomes less convenient until everyone quietly stops taking it. And because this can happen in different parts of the delta at different times, the network rearranges in a patchwork way. If you are listening to this as you drift towards sleep, you do not need to hold all the details. Just keep one image. Water arrives as a single ribbon. It spreads into many ribbons. Then the ribbons fray into dampness. Then dampness becomes air. And in between, the landscape is constantly being revised by tiny decisions, where sediment drops, where plants root, where animals trample, where fire opens space, where a termite mound lifts the ground. Now, with all of that in your pocket, you can let the calendar become more personal again. You are sitting near a channel during the time of rising water. It is not a dramatic rise. It is a patient one. Each day, the edge creeps outward into grass. The water looks calm, but it is moving, and it is bringing new dissolved nutrients and fine particles that will settle when it slows. In the early phase, the water is clear enough that you can see submerged plants. Later, as flow spreads and stirs, some areas cloud. In the shallowest zones, the water warms quickly, and you can feel heat rising off it in late afternoon, like the surface is exhaling. At night, the air above the water is slightly warmer than the air over dry ground, because water releases heat slowly. That can create tiny breezes, subtle shifts in air movement. You may hear reeds whispering, and you might think it is only wind, but it is also temperature difference. Water shaping air, air shaping evaporation, evaporation shaping water. Everything is in conversation. Then the peak flood passes, and you notice that the edge stops advancing. It pauses, as if thinking. For a while, the delta holds its breath, and then, without announcement, the retreat begins. The first places to dry are the shallowest. Small puddles vanish. Thin sheets become damp soil. The floodplain changes color from reflective dark to matte green to dusty tan. Cracks appear in the finest sediments. In slightly lower depressions, water lingers longer and plants stay greener. The retreat is not an evacuation. It is a sorting. Water concentrates into deeper channels and lagoons, leaving behind moist ground that will support growth for a time. Animals adjust without drama. They shift their routes. They cluster near remaining water. They spread out again when water returns. So the year is not a circle. It is a slow oscillation. And because you have been thinking about meanders all night, you can see how even the calendar has bends. The flood pulse does not move as a straight wave. It moves through channels, around islands, into floodplains, and back again. It is guided by the same subtle topography that guides the river itself. It is guided by the same sediment deposits that meanders create. Old channels can become pathways for floodwater, even if they are not active as main flow routes. Abandoned meanders, those ghost curves, can still fill with water during high stages, becoming temporary wetlands again. The landscape keeps using its old shapes. So meandering is not just how the river moves, it is how the flood remembers. Now, your mind naturally wants to compare this to other places again, because comparison is how humans learn without admitting it. You think of a river floodplain in a temperate climate where floods come with spring melt and storms. There, the flood can be sharp, fast, cold. In the Okavango, the flood is slow, warm, and delayed. Both create fertile soils. Both create shifting channels, but the mood is different. Here, the violence is more subtle. It is not a sudden tearing. It is a steady rearrangement that you only notice when a familiar route is gone. And that mood is what makes this inland delta such a good bedtime geography story. The processes are constant, but the pace is almost considerate. Almost, because the delta can still be dangerous. Not because it is angry, but because it is indifferent. Water hides depth. Mud hides holes. Animals hide in reeds. A channel that looks shallow might drop suddenly at an outside bend. A papyrus mat that looks like solid ground might be floating. The delta punishes assumptions. Quietly. Congratulations, you have entered a place where the map is seasonal and the ground is sometimes an opinion. And yet, people move through it year after year because humans are good at learning rhythms when they have to. Mokoro routes, those narrow canoe paths, follow channels that are known to hold water during certain phases. Communities time movement with water availability. Fishing follows flood timing. Grazing follows retreating edges. The human calendar here is written in the same ink as the ecological one. Now, since you have been living in this cycle for a while, it is time to let your attention drift outward again to other meandering rivers. Places where water draws while it moves, but writes different endings into the land. Not every meander lives in a delta. Many live in broad valleys, where a river is free to wander across a floodplain, leaving behind those same oxbows and scroll bars like quiet signatures. You move in your mind to a wide, flat valley somewhere else. The air is different, the plants are different, but the physics is the same, and that is always the comfort. The planet repeats its habits. Here, The river is a single channel with big looping bends. Over decades, the bends migrate outward. Over centuries, the river can shift from one side of the valley to the other, simply by continuing to erode on the outside and deposit on the inside. The floodplain becomes a broad belt of former channels. The soils are rich because floods keep adding fine sediment. People farm it because of course they do. Humans see fertile flat land and lose all caution. And in these valleys, meandering is often encouraged by fine, cohesive sediments and by vegetation that stabilizes banks just enough to allow bends to grow rather than simply collapse. If banks are too loose, the river can braid instead, splitting into many shallow channels. If banks are too hard, the river may stay straighter or cut down. Meanders thrive in the middle ground, where banks hold long enough to be sculpted. So when you see a perfect looping river from above, it is not just water being artistic. It is water meeting the right kind of resistance. Now think about what happens during a flood in such a valley. Water overtops banks and spreads across the floodplain. It slows. It drops fine sediment, especially near the channel edges. Over time, natural levees build along the river, slightly higher ridges next to the channel. Behind those levees, the floodplain can be slightly lower and wetter, forming back swamps. These are the quieter parts of floodplains where water lingers longer and fine mud accumulates. So, even a floodplain has zones, levee ridges, back swamps, old channels, point bar ridges, and those zones matter for where people build, where crops grow, where forests persist. In some river systems, you can see these patterns from the air as subtle stripes and curves in vegetation. In others, you feel them underfoot as slight rises and dips. You think flat means uniform. Wrong. Flat means sensitive. Now, because meanders move, the river eventually threatens anything built too close to the outer banks. The outside bend is where erosion happens. The cut bank migrates. Trees topple. Soil falls in. The river eats laterally. If you build a house there, you are volunteering it as future sediment. People respond the way they always do. They try to stop the river from moving. They place rocks along the outer bank, called riprap, to armor it. They build levees to contain floods. They straighten the river to reduce meandering. They dredge channels. They build training walls, and sometimes, for a while, it works. But the river's energy does not vanish. It gets redirected. If you prevent erosion in one spot, the river may erode more in another. If you straighten the channel, you increase slope and speed, which can cause incision, the river cutting down. That can disconnect the river from its floodplain, reducing natural sediment deposition and sometimes making floods worse downstream. So, control is never free. It always has a bill. The Okavango, because it is not heavily engineered at the scale of many industrial rivers, still shows you what a river does when it is allowed to negotiate with its landscape. That does not mean the Okavango is untouched by human influence. It means the primary architecture is still driven by water, sediment, plants, and time. Now, let the comparison continue gently, because there is a kind of sleepy satisfaction in seeing the same mechanism produce different landscapes. You drift to a river in a colder region where the flood pulse is driven by melting snow. The water arrives cold, fast, and full. The river may still meander, but the banks may be frozen part of the year, and thawing can cause sudden slumps. In such places, you can get thermokarst features, where ice-rich ground melts and collapses, creating ponds and irregular channels. The river's meanders interact with permafrost, and the landscape can become pocked and unstable. The principle is still erosion and deposition, but the materials behave differently because ice is part of the ground. In a desert region, you might see a meandering river that flows only seasonally. When it flows, it can be violent because dry soils do not absorb water quickly. Flash floods can carve and reshape channels quickly, but between flows, wind can rework sediments, and vegetation may be sparse, so banks can shift differently. In a tropical lowland, meanders can be huge, and oxbow lakes can dot forests. The river can migrate across wide belts over centuries, and the abandoned channels become wetlands that shape forest composition. So you see, meandering is a grammar, and each climate writes a different sentence. And once you have that grammar, you start spotting old river stories everywhere. A curved lake in a flat valley, cut off from the main channel, is likely an oxbow. A crescent-shaped wet meadow might be a former channel. A series of parallel curved ridges could be scroll bars from migrating point bars. The landscape is full of these quiet fossils. Now bring this back to the Okavango again, because that is the anchor of tonight's wandering. In the Delta, the equivalent of oxbows and abandoned channels are everywhere, but they are often more subtle because the network is distributary and shifting. Channels can be abandoned not only by a single cutoff, but by gradual clogging and avulsion. A former channel might become a papyrus-filled swale, then a seasonal wetland, then a grassy depression that still holds water longer than its surroundings. The delta keeps its old roots as softer scars. And because the delta is so flat, even these small scars matter for future flooding. When a high water year comes, water will preferentially spread into low areas, including old channels. So, the past remains hydraulically relevant. The delta has memory. Now, if you are still awake enough to be mildly curious, you might wonder about the Panhandle itself, why it is called that, and why it looks the way it does from above. The Panhandle is a long, narrow extension of the Delta system, a corridor where the Okavango River remains relatively confined before it fans out. Its existence is tied to subtle regional topography and tectonic structure. The broader basin has been shaped by faulting, creating a gentle gradient that guides the river into this corridor. The details can get technical, but you do not need a lecture. You just need the feeling of it. The land is slightly lower along this path, and water is obedient. And because water is obedient, it repeatedly uses the same corridor, reinforcing it. A river that keeps flowing in one zone will keep maintaining that zone, deepening it slightly, building levees, discouraging alternative paths, at least until something changes enough to force a new arrangement. So the Panhandle is, in part, self-reinforcing. It exists because the land guides water, and water then maintains the guidance. This is one of Earth's favorite loops. Process creates form, form guides process. And downstream, the delta repeats that loop at many smaller scales. Now, you can let your attention settle into another slow realization about meanders, one that is easy to miss if you only think of rivers as surface features. Meandering is not just lateral migration. It is also sediment storage. When a river migrates, it leaves behind deposits that become part of the floodplain. Point bars become layers of sand. Overbank floods add layers of silt and clay. Over time, the floodplain becomes a stacked archive. If you could drill into it, you would find old channel sands, then flood muds, then more sands, then more muds. The river's position shifts, and the deposits record the shift. So the landscape is not only shaped in plan view, like a map, it is shaped in cross-section, like a layer cake. And in a delta like the Okavango, those layers include organic rich wetland deposits, sandy channel deposits, and fine floodplain sediments. The subsurface is a patchwork, and that patchwork influences groundwater flow. Water infiltrates more easily through sandy channel deposits than through clay-rich floodplain muds. That means old channels can become preferential pathways for groundwater, even after the surface channel is gone. So the ghost of a channel can exist underground too, as a band of more permeable sediment, which means the delta's memory is three-dimensional. Now, slowly, the night version of geography returns. You are not drawing diagrams anymore. You are moving through a place that changes in increments. You paddle along a channel that feels stable because it has been here for years. The banks are held by roots. The water is deep enough to stay open, but you know quietly that stability here is conditional. You come around an outside bend and you see a cut bank that is undercut, a shelf of soil hanging slightly over water. It looks solid until you notice small cracks near the top, where drying and wetting have weakened it. This bank will fall eventually. Maybe not tonight, maybe not this season, but the river has already done the math. The helical flow in the bend is pushing fastest water against it, undercutting it grain by grain. One day, it will slump in, and the channel will adjust. And then, downstream, that slump becomes sediment, and that sediment may be dropped on a point bar somewhere, building the inside of a bend you have not reached yet. So even a collapsing bank is not an ending. It is a transfer. This is the calm cruelty of rivers. Nothing is wasted. Everything is repurposed. And because you have been listening long enough, you can feel the cyclical rhythm forming under everything. Bend, deposit, flood, fade, begin again. But you are not returning to the end of the story yet. You are still inside the working middle, where the Okavango teaches you how to watch change without expecting it to hurry. So you keep drifting through comparisons, through mechanics, through the quiet calendar, letting the delta keep time in the background, while you notice how all meandering rivers, in their own climates, practice the same slow art of refusal. Refusal to be straight, refusal to be permanent, refusal to end neatly. And that refusal, out here, is what makes the land feel alive enough to be unsettling and steady enough to feel safe. For now, you stay close to the water's edge in your mind, watching the way a channel narrows slightly where vegetation has crept in, watching the way flow concentrates and speeds up through a tighter passage, watching the way that speed will likely scour the bed and keep the throat open a little longer. Then you watch the same channel widen into a lagoon where water slows and begins to drop its fine load, and where plants have all the time in the world to take root and start the slow process of closing things again. And you start noticing how the delta is always toggling between opening routes and sealing them shut, as if it cannot decide